Some people ask me, why Stalin now? My answer to them will be, why not? There are several reasons why the treatment of Stalin by Western historians should be analyzed and wherever necessary criticized. Stalin, by a long chalk, one of the greatest personalities in the history of the world. He was heading a country that won the biggest and the most murderous war ever fought by mankind until today. However, except a few honorable persons, what we get from the West, especially from the Western universities, are all one sided pro West version of the Second World War, which all try to say that Stalin won the war in spite of himself. If such histories are not questioned and criticized, there's a danger that even our history will be written in that fashion by the West. Even even now, there are revisionist histories of India's freedom movement which portray British imperialism almost avuncular and without any serious malice. Am I supporting Stalin's crimes? No, of course I am not. I too think that he had committed serious excesses, and most of them now look unnecessary and even monstrously harsh. At the same time, there are several willful exaggerations to portray Stalin as a psychopathic monster, which he most certainly was not. He was living in an extremely violent time. Stalin came to power in the early 20s of the last century and was at the helm of affairs until his death in 1953. I am not going to cover the major events that took place in the years when the Soviet Union was built under his leadership with much violence and mayhem. I will speak about this period sometime later, in fact. My main talk today is on Stalin, the war leader. The Second World War is in fact the most important event in the history of the world, for many centuries, I should say. And it is important in India because there is little doubt that India would not have got its independence in 1947 had the war not taken place. It would eventually arrive, but perhaps at a much later date. Also, the present day's India has been shaped by the plan years of the 50s and the 60s, and the very idea of plan was taken from the Soviet Union, as we all know. Stalin said this in 1931. He said, the history of old Russia consisted, among other things, in her being ceaselessly beaten by her backwardness. She was beaten by the Mongol Khans. She was beaten by the Turkish Beys. She was beaten by the Swedish feudal rulers. She was beaten by the Polish and Lithuanian lords. She was beaten by Anglo-French capitalists. She was beaten by the Japanese barons. Everyone gave her a beating for her backwardness, for military backwardness, for cultural backwardness, for state backwardness, for industrial backwardness, for agricultural backwardness. They beat her, they beat her because it was profitable and could be done with impunity. Such is the law of the exploiters. Beat the backward, you are weak. So you are in the wrong, therefore you can be beaten and enslaved. We have fallen behind the advanced countries by 50 to 100 years. We must close that gap in 10 years. Either we do this or we will be crushed. Stalin felt that he was being encircled by the imperialist powers and Russia had to become a major industrial country if she were to survive. He was willing to pay any price to close the gap between the Western nations and Russia within a period of 10 years. You may call it a miracle, but he did close the gap to a great extent and made Russia a mighty industrial nation. He was able to meet Hitler when he arrived with a well-equipped army. By 1939, Russian industrial production levels were far higher than they had been in the late 20s. The USSR was able to play a major part in the defeat of Germany. In fact, the most crucial part in the defeat of Germany during World War II, and emerged as a superpower, ranking second only to the USA, only because Stalin built Russia during the crucial period. Spectacular successes were the improved supply of electricity and the great number of machines built. Almost all heavy industries enjoyed substantial increases in production. There were many large-scale industrial and building developments such as the Dnieper Dam, the Moscow Metro, and the many steel works. The life of ordinary Russians too improved after 1917. They had city housing schemes, universal health care, pensions, and sickness benefits. From 1934 onwards, it was compulsory for children to receive 11 years of education. In fact, literacy declined from about 15% in the late 20s to about 18% in 1939. And USSR was also largely free from unemployment suffered in other countries due to the depression of the 30s. So Russia was improving. Its military is also being constructed by Stalin. In terms of what Stalin wanted, the plans were a success because most of the so-called failings were not things that would balance what Stalin saw as successes. The kulaks were dead or exiled in 1932. Resistance was crushed, and by 1941, 98% of farms joined the collectives. Grain produce was not at its maximum, but it was stable and could be relied upon. Food was reaching the cities regularly, and newer mechanized techniques, though not used to their best, freed up more workers for the new factories. Every year, surplus food was provided to sell abroad, and this allowed an input of foreign finance, which helped the new cities and industrial centers grow. Incidentally, grain production in Russia, even at the famine times, were never less than 60 million tons. By way of comparison, India was producing 50 million tons of grain in 1950 for a population of 380 million, more than twice the population of USSR in 1939. So the Holodomor figures seem to be widely exaggerated, but that's a different story. I am not going to cover it here. And we must also remember that more than 85% of the total expenditure which Russia made was on heavy industry, and during the wartime it increased to more than 90%. Okay, as Kotkin says in one of his recent lectures, the Soviet Union remained economically much less strong than Germany when the conflict between the two countries started in 1941. Still, Stalin was able to make good the losses suffered by him in battlefields, but Hitler was not able to do so. Remember, the second front was opened by the West after much goading by Stalin 3 years after Russia was attacked. By that time, Russia had recovered the territories lost by her and was advancing into Poland. Remember, the figures are absolutely mind-boggling. The front was at no time less than 2,500 miles. 2,500 miles. You know, the distance between Kargil and Kanyakumari is only 2,400 miles. This was the Russian front. This front was never less than 2,500 miles. The Nazi army, of course, was formidable. Only a year ago, Hitler attacked Belgium on 10th May 1940, and Dunkirk evacuation started on 26 May 1940. It took Hitler just 16 days to finish off the British expeditionary forces, and the French army. They simply ran away. A substantial part of the French army joined Hitler later. The achievement of the Red Army in World War II surpassed those of any other army in history. Facing invasion by the German army at the peak of its performance in 1941, the Red Army was all but annihilated, losing more than 4 million casualties, killed, missing, or taken prisoner. The Russian reaction was to create a second army during the summer of 1941. They created more than 160 rifle divisions, which the German again all but destroyed by December 1941. The Red Army in fact lost more than 150 divisions in the first 6 months of the war. However, the Russians began the creation of a third army in August 1941, and by November 1941, they had formed another 150 rifle divisions, which stopped the Germans at Moscow and drove them back. Beginning in December, the Russians formed a fourth Red Army, some of which were lost in Ukraine in the spring of 1942, but the majority completed the training by the fall of 1942 and stopped the Germans at Stalingrad. No other nation has lost 1/3 of its almost territory and its population and its pre-war army and replaced it 3 times in the course of about 12 to 18 months, all the while fighting the most highly trained and experienced armies the world has ever seen. This achievement was possible largely because of Stalin, who was at the helm of affairs, and the Russian people implicitly trusted him. Russian counteroffensives were often described as mad ventures with unnecessary loss of lives. But as Kotkin says, in a recent analysis of German documents, which are written by German war scholars, which reveal that these offensives created irreparable damage to Wehrmacht, from which it was unable to recover. I will talk about the actual battles if time permits. Still, in fact, Kotkin also makes a telling point. In 1914, Russia had a really big army, a really very big army Russia had. And Germany didn't even enter the Russian territories. Still, the defeat to Germany cost the Tsar his throne and later his life. In 1941, the situation was worse. Russia lost, as I said earlier, huge tracts of land, perhaps twice as big as France. Still, the Russian people trusted Stalin. He was in fact made the supreme commander. the army held in high esteem, as is seen from various memoirs of Russian generals, historians, and other observers. In fact, the war cry used by Soviet soldiers during the Second World War was Za Rodinu, Za Stalina, meaning for motherland, for Stalin. In fact, Stalin prepared Russia for war right from the day Hitler assumed power. But he was always desirous of peace. He was acutely aware that Russia was not without any real friends in the world. And one of the treaties he signed was in fact with Germany. Firstly, the first treaty he signed was with Germany. The Treaty of Berlin was signed in April 1926, which pledged neutrality in the event of an attack on the other by a third party for the next 5 years. When Hitler came to power, Stalin signed a treaty with France in 1935 with the aim of restraining Nazi Germany. The Soviets also signed a treaty with the same year with Czechoslovakia, under which Soviet Union pledged military aid to Czechoslovakia in the event of an attack on that country by a third party. Soviet assistance was, however, conditional upon France, which also had a mutual assistance treaty with Czechoslovakia, simultaneously fulfilling its obligations. This is very clear. Stalin had a pact with both France and Czechoslovakia, and if Czechoslovakia was in trouble, France should come to aid and Russia also should come to aid. Stalin was crying hoarse even when Hitler annexed Austria in March 1938. But when the Nazi Chancellor was asking for Sudetenland, a part of Czechoslovakia, to be given to Germany, he made this demand later that year in September 1938. Stalin wanted to evoke the treaty with France. He was even prepared to send the troops in order to stop Stalin from his aggressive design. But France was timid. Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, was a hardcore reactionary, and he was prepared to deal with Stalin. He made 3 trips to Munich in Germany to appease Hitler, and the Munich Pact was signed on 30th September 1938, even without inviting Russia, handing over Sudetenland to Germany. Chamberlain spoke of peace for our time, but Germany grabbed the entire Czechoslovakia in a few months. Still, Stalin did not give up hope. He strove for an anti-Hitler alliance with the British and the French in the year 1939. These negotiations had begun after the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia in March 1939 and were prompted by German threat to Poland, Romania and other East European countries. In April, the Soviets in fact proposed a full-blown triple alliance between Britain, France and the USSR, a military coalition that would guarantee European security against German aggression and if necessary go to war with Hitler. But France and Britain were reluctant. The negotiations dragged on till August 1939 before breaking down. In fact, France and Britain, they sent very junior officers and they went to Russia by the slowest means of transport available. The ostensible reason for the breakdown was the Soviet demand that Britain and France guarantee that Poland and Romania would allow the Red Army passage through the territory upon the outbreak of war with Germany. The problem was that Poland and Romania were both authoritarian anti-communist states and they were not willing to concede the Red Army an automatic right of passage in the event of war. But the Soviet insisted, however, that their military plans depended on advancing through Poland and Romania to repulse a German attack. Without such a military agreement, there was no point to have a political front against Hitler who would not be deterred from war by any diplomatic agreement. Stalin also did not believe that the British and the French were sincere. Yeah, he didn't. In fact, they were not. He thought that they were not serious about fighting Hitler. He feared him, said that they were maneuvering to get him to do their fighting for them. As Stalin later told Churchill, he had the impression that the talks were insincere and only for the purpose of intimidating Hitler, with whom the Western powers would later come to terms. Therefore, when an urgent personal message to Stalin on 20th August, Hitler pressed for Ribbentrop to be allowed to go to Moscow to negotiate a protocol, pointing out that the tension between Germany and Poland has become intolerable and that there was no time to lose. Stalin replied the very next day, agreeing to Ribbentrop's visit. The result was the Nazi-Soviet Pact of August 1939, which shocked and surprised the world. The published text of the non-aggression treaty was same as any other non-aggression pact Soviet Union concluded in the 20s and 30s. Apart from the notable absence of a provision for the denunciation of the agreement in the event of aggression by Germany or Russia on a third party. As the omission indicated, the fact was fundamentally a pledge of Soviet neutrality during the coming German-Polish war. It was very, very clear. It is clear from this agreement. In return for this favor, Stalin received Hitler's promises of friendship and non-aggression, and more importantly, certain provisions in a secret additional protocol. The first clause of that protocol was that the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania and Finland will fall under the Soviet sphere of influence. The second clause of that protocol was the division of Poland. The eastern side of Poland will come to Russia, and western side, major part will go to Germany. The third clause was about Bessarabia, which was then the part of Romania, but Russia claimed that it was stolen from Russia in 1918 by Romania. When the Nazi-Soviet pact was made, the Wehrmacht, the German army crossed the line, which was supposed to be there between Germany and the German sphere of influence and the Russian sphere of influence. The Wehrmacht moved eastwards. Okay. When Stalin found that out, he asked Red Army to go and occupy that area, and there were clashes between German forces and the Red Army forces. There were casualties, in fact. Okay. Then Hitler backed off, because the Stalin did not want to march into Poland immediately. In fact, he did it in the war started in 1st September 1939. Stalin did not march till 18th or 19th September. Okay, he marched only because the German army was coming eastwards, towards the Russian border, which is very dangerous to him. The modern historians, they hide one thing. As regards Poland, the territories Russia was speaking about was exactly the same which was with Russia, but were grabbed by Poland when Russia was weak. Even today, they don't form the part of modern Poland. Okay, so this betrayal of Poland by Western historians is a blatant lie. The same is the case with Bessarabia. Even today, it's not part of Romania. One person interestingly, who welcomed the Soviet move into Poland was Churchill. In a famous radio broadcast on 1st October 1939, he argued Russia had pursued a cold policy of self-interest. We could have wished that as Russian army should be standing on the present line as the friends and allies of Poland instead of as invaders. But that the Russian army should stand on this line was clearly necessary for the safety of Russia against the Nazi menace. What is important is that Stalin refused to sign any military treaty with Hitler. Stalin was sure that the treaty was at best a temporary reprieve, and he had to strengthen the Russian army as quickly as possible. He got almost 2 years. What is conveniently forgotten by many historians is that nobody expected Poland to fold up as quickly as it eventually did. In fact, the West kept almost quiet except making some routine noises. They didn't attack Germany at all. Okay, even before that, even before 1941, the phony war period in Europe, where absolutely the guns never sounded in Europe before Hitler turned westward, showed that neither France nor Britain had any stomach for war. The war against, as I said earlier, the war against France was a farce, in fact. The Maginot Line was bypassed and the famous, the legendary 100 Division French army simply disintegrated. The British, of course, the BEF, the British Expeditionary Forces were sitting ducks. It took, as I said earlier, it took only 14 days for Germany to defeat Germany, Germany to defeat France and rush to the English Channel. Fortunately, they stopped for rest and Dunkirk happened. Okay, Dunkirk badly managed to hide the shameful performance of both the British and the French armies. The period between 1939 and 1941 is very, very interesting. This period between signing of the pact and the German invasion of 1941 was used by Stalin in strengthening his borders. The three small Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia and Lithuania, succumbed quickly. Finland proved to be a tough customer. The winter was not Stalin's choosing. He would have preferred a negotiated solution to the border, and it was security issues that sparkled the conflict. The major issue was the border. Leningrad was now the present day St. Petersburg. The Leningrad was perilously close to the Finnish border. Stalin told Finland that in the event of an aggression either by Britain and France or by Germany, Finland will not be able to withstand it. So the Finnish territory will be used for attacking Leningrad, because Leningrad within the artillery range, 20 kilometers. The distance was only 20 miles. It was only 20 miles. So what Stalin said was, he wanted to shift the boundary northwestward. He wanted more land. In compensation, he was prepared to give territorial compensation in Soviet Karelia in the far north. So he was prepared to give land to Finland and wanted to take back this land which was near Leningrad. When the negotiations failed, the Red Army in December 1939 launched a broad front attack on Finnish defences, applying 5 separate armies. About 1.2 million soldiers attacked, supported by 1,500 tanks and 3,000 aircraft. The main attack was on the so-called Mannerheim line. If you see the map now, you will find out, on the Karelian Isthmus, The initial Soviet attacks failed. The defenses were formidable, the Finns fought well, the weather was bad, and the Soviet Union was not lucky. The Soviet offensives were also very clumsy and badly coordinated. In January 1940, the Soviets regrouped and reinforced their armies, and Timoshenko is a very able general. He was appointed as overall command of the Soviet assault on Finland. And in February, he launched a very well coordinated offensive, again concentrated on the Mannerheim line. And this time the Soviet Union succeeded, and succeeded in breaching the Finnish defenses, and they were about to enter into Helsinki. When Finland offered to negotiate, Stalin accepted that negotiation is possible, and Finland in fact gave up the territory which Stalin asked for without getting anything. Earlier he was prepared to give additional territory to Finland, but that territory was not given to Finland after this agreement. It appeared for a time, when the Finnish war was there, it appeared for a time that the Western powers would intervene to help Finland, and they would get into conflict with the Soviet Union. But the Finland surrender changed all that. The Soviet casualties was not, casualties were very high. In fact, Soviet Union, about 50,000 people died. About 54 people died, and of course the Finnish casualties is more, but that doesn't mean anything. However, the Winter War is often depicted as a great failure of Stalin's leadership. It was of course a costly campaign, and it greatly embarrassed the Red Army and encouraged Hitler to think that an invasion of Russia would be relatively easy. It isolated Soviet Union diplomatically and brought it to the brink of war with Britain and France. It also made an enemy of Finland, who joined the Germans later in 1941. But that was not how the war and its outcome was seen by Stalin in 1941. The war had been won after all, and it took only 3 months, despite difficult terrain and weather conditions. The Soviet Union had achieved its territorial goals, and the timely conclusion of war had thwarted Anglo-French imperialist intrigues. The war had, of course, explored some flaws in the armed forces training, equipment structure, and the military doctrine, but that was a good thing as long as steps were taken to correct them. If anything, the Finnish war gave Stalin confidence that the Soviet Union was strong enough to deal with the unpredictable ramifications of an eventual future wider European war. In any case, Stalin did everything not to annoy Hitler. He signed a neutrality agreement with Japan. He also signed a non-aggression pact with Yugoslavia, but didn't do much when that country was swallowed by Germany in May 1941. But Stalin relied on his own reasoning to assess Hitler's likely intentions. He thought it did not make sense for Germany to turn against Russia before Britain was finished off. Why fight a two-front war when the Soviet Union self-evidently posed no immediate danger to Germany? This was what he thought. This rationalization was reinforced by the assessment of some of the intelligence reports presented to him. For example, in March 1941, the Soviet military intelligence presented a summary of reports on the timing of likely German military action against the USSR. The report concluded that the most likely date for the beginning of military action against the USSR is after victory over England or after a conclusion of an honorable peace agreement between Germany and England. As Kotkin says, is very important. As Kotkin says, not one written document was given to Stalin in support of the impending German invasion. It was always hearsay. He said that, it was heard in that party, It was heard by German ambassador, things like that. Not even a single document was given to Stalin during that period. Adding to this uncertainty was the extensive disinformation campaign waged by the Germans, which was designed to explain away the massive concentration of forces at the Soviet border. The Germans began by asserting that the military buildup was a defensive measure. Then they said that it was ruse to lull the British into a false sense of security. Another story was that the German forces were there only to not to invade but to intimidate the Soviets. Okay. One of the most prevailing rumors was that even if Hitler did attack, he would first present an ultimatum. All these rumors were floating about before the actual war came. Thus, while Stalin could hope, even believe that Hitler would not attack, the evidence was clear that the German dictator might be planning to attack soon. Stalin responded to this, contrary to what people say. Stalin responded to this possibility by the continuation and indeed acceleration of his preparations for war, including a massive build-up of Soviet frontline forces. In May-June, more than 800,000 reservists were called up. In mid-May, 28 divisions were ordered to the western districts of the USSR. And then orders were issued to districts to camouflage, target and disperse aircraft. By June 1941, Red Army had more than 300 divisions comprising about 5.5 million personnel, of whom about 2.7 million were stationed in the western border districts. In fact, on the night of attack, 22nd June 1941, this vast force was put on alert and warned to expect a surprise attack by the Germans. Stalin, of course, did not think it mattered much if Hitler was able to spring a surprise attack, because according to Soviet military doctrine, the outbreak of hostilities with Germany would be followed by a period of 2 to 4 weeks, during which both sides would mobilize and concentrate their main forces for battle. In the meantime, the Soviet military doctrine assumed that there will be tactical battles along the frontier and limited to penetrations and incursions by mobile forces, probing for weaknesses and preparing the way for major outflanking movements. In any event, they thought the decisive battles would be fought a few weeks after the outbreak of war. Again, the model was the First World War. But Stalin's generals were not stupid, as the cliche goes, simply preparing to fight the First World War again. They had observed his German blitzkrieg victories over Poland and France and noted the effectiveness of concentrative tank offensives and massive encirclement maneuvers by the Wehrmacht's highly mobile forces. But they did not think that the Red Army would share the fate of their French and Polish counterparts. They saw Poland as weak militarily, and the French with the Maginot mentality as having no stomach for fight. They were confident Soviet defenses would hold and provide cover while the Red Army mobilized its main forces for battle. In fact, many military historians have argued Stalin and the Soviet command believed that they were dealing with Hitler from a position of strength and not from a position of weakness. Stalin was certainly not frightened of a surprise attack by Hitler. At most, he thought it would cause a loss of a few tactical frontier battles. On that calculation, Stalin's gamble on the preservation of peace makes a lot more sense. The payoff could be a delay of war until 1942, by which time the Soviet defenses would be much stronger and the country's preparation for war complete. Paradoxically then, German surprise attack on 22nd June 1941 surprised no one, not even Stalin. But the nasty surprise was the nature of the attack. A strategic attack in which the Wehrmacht committed its main forces to battle from day one of the war, slamming through and shattering Red Army defenses and penetrating deep into Russia with strong armored columns that surrounded the disorganized and immobile Soviet armies. This was something which the military strategies of the Soviet Union did not foresee. As Zhukov admits in his memoir, at that time, our military theoretical science generally did not consider the profound problems of strategic defense, mistakenly considering it as not so important. When Germans attacked on 22nd June 1941, both Timoshenko and Zhukov responded by ordering for the implementation of long-standing plans for offensive action. Even as Germans drove deep into Soviet territory and arriving at the gates of Moscow and Leningrad, the Red Army preferred countermeasure was to attack and at when and where they could. Eventually, of course, they learned the virtues of defense, but only because it had to. And the doctrine of offensive action persisted throughout the war. The extent of the tragedy of 22nd June 1941 from the Soviet point of view was summed up by the fate of the massive army Stalin had assembled to counter the German invasion. By the end of the year, Red Army has lost 200 divisions in battle and suffered more than 4 million casualties. Among the losses were about 1.5 lakh officers and 40 generals killed and 44 captured. And in fact, many observers, contemporary observers, expected the battle-hardened German army that had so easily conquered Poland and France to achieve similar results in Russia. Others thought the Soviets might have made a better fight of it, but they collapsed too quickly. But what surprised everyone though was that the Red Army could survive the enormous damage inflicted by the Germans and then begin to push back what had been the greatest invasion in military history. Most of the biased Western historians have spread a canard that Stalin was so shocked by the invasion that he simply stopped working and sat in his bungalow, his dacha, sulking. It was only after Soviet leaders went to him and pleaded with him, asked him to take charge, he relented. But as Zhukov says, Stalin himself was strong-willed and no coward. It was only once I saw him somewhat depressed. That was the dawn of June 1941, when his belief that the war could be avoided was shattered. After June 22, 1941, and throughout the war, Stalin firmly governed the country. Perhaps a better guide to Stalin's personal response to German attack is the contemporary evidence of his actions during the first days of the war. According to his appointments diary, when war broke out, Stalin held numerous meetings with members of the Soviet military and political leadership. The early days of war required many decisions by him. On the day the war broke out, he authorized 20 different decrees and orders. On 22nd June, he established his military high command, the Stavka, the so-called Stavka was established on 23rd June, chaired by a mixed political and military body, to oversee the the strategic direction of the war. In fact, on 24 June, he resolved to establish a council of evacuation to organize evacuation of people and material from the war zone. Okay. On 29, Stalin issued an urgent directive to the party and state organizations in the frontline areas, ordering them to fight to the last drop of blood in defense. But what was the, let us see the German plan. What was the German plan? In fact, the primary effort of the German plan was the destruction of the bulk of Red Army by deep penetrating armored spearheads, which was what they did from the north, center and the south. In fact, if you see the map, they were moving from the west to east, but the front started at Archangel and it was right at the Volga River at the end, From north to the Archangel and south to the Volga River. The distance, as I said, is about 2,500 miles. It's a huge front, The plan was the first decisive phase was expected to take 8 to 10 weeks. The remaining Russian soldiers were then to be pursued relentlessly. During the second stage, besides taking Moscow, German formations were to seize the economically important the Donets River basin in the south. The final objective was a line stretching from Volga River to Archangel, as I said, In fact, there were 3 army groups are formed by Germany. Okay. The army group south was to drive its strong left wing with mobile forces the lead towards Kiev, destroy the Russian forces in Galicia and in western Ukraine, while they were still west of the river Dnieper, and achieve the early capture of the Dnieper crossings at and below Kiev for the continuation of operations on both sides of the river. That is, they are moving constantly eastwards after crossing the river. Army Group Center was to annihilate and encircle the enemy in White Russia, the present day Belarus, by driving forward strong forces on its wings. It was to win the area around Smolensk and achieve cooperation between the mobile units and the Army Group North. This Army Group Center was to advance towards Moscow with the help of Army Group North. The Army Group North was to destroy enemy forces in the Baltic area and deprive the Russian fleet of its bases by occupying the Baltic harbors, including Leningrad and Kronstadt. This is the plan, and they almost succeeded. Germany almost succeeded in their plans, exactly how they planned in 1940. At the beginning, the opposing forces were relatively equal. The 152 German combat divisions, it included 19 panzer divisions and 14 motorized infantry unit. And then added to it was, about 14 Romanian and 21 Finnish divisions. And what is important is that the German army were commanded by some of the legendary generals ever to have fought in the history of warfare. Field Marshal Lieb commanded the Army Group North. Field Marshal Bock commanded the Army Group Center. And von Rundstedt, of course, he commanded Army Group South. They had under them generals whose names are, should be familiar to every student of the Second World War. Names like, Guderian, Manstein, Kuchler, Busch, Strauss, Kluge, Weiss and Reichenau. These are all legendary names, legendary German generals. They all fought in Russia during the initial era of the war. In fact, in the opening part of the invasion, Army Group North with these 3 armies struck into the Baltic states, overran Lithuania in a few days, crossing the river Dwina at several places, and controlled most of Latvia at the end of the first week of July. On the central front, as I said, between the Baltic states and the prepared marshes, the Army Group Center with 4 armies smashed through the Soviet defenses, seized eastern Polish territories annexed by Soviet Union in 1939, the first 2 weeks of fighting. Okay, the same thing was done in the south. Okay, in fact, only in the south, the army group south, it faced numerically superior Soviet forces and encountered fierce resistance. Consequently, Rundstedt's, of course, units advanced slowly and became entangled in a fierce battle with the Soviet 8th Armored Corps, I think, 8th Armored Corps, I think. The German, of course, the German army, however, decimated the Soviet forces, broke through his positions, and pushed southwardly towards Kiev. Okay, and by end of July, I think by September, of course, they completely encircled Kiev and taking about 700,000 prisoners. Okay, so now the major city in the south had been taken. The important battle of the three army groups involved in the Operation Barbarossa, which was called the Operation Barbarossa, the three groups, one box army group center, that enjoyed the most spectacular successes in the initial stage of invasion. This army group swept into central Russia, grabbing more than 500,000 prisoners and seized Minsk and Smolensk by late July. They were all towns towns west of Moscow. Okay, Smolensk, in fact, is about 200 miles from Moscow. By the end of September, General Guderian captured even some more, some more towns like Orel, cities like Orel were captured by him. And by October 18, they were just 50 miles away from Moscow. They closed in on Moscow from all directions. Okay, the Battle of Moscow, codenamed Operation Typhoon, was now launched. By October 28th, Moscow proclaimed a stage of siege. It looked as if everything was lost. The German forces were just 50 miles away from Moscow. Now, let us consider two more aspects of this war. What was the effect of the purges on the Red Army, especially the execution of Tukhachevsky, execution of Tukhachevsky. Okay. It is worse than stupid to claim that the Red Army's initial losses were due to the purges. If that was the case, it would be difficult to explain how they successfully countered the massive Nazi forces outside the gates of Moscow within a short gap of 3 months. In fact, many Soviet generals were the students of Tukhachevsky, and they learned the art of war from him. This is what Zhukov says in his autobiography. Let me read this. Tukhachevsky had views he had set out in a monograph he was then writing on novel problems of warfare. We were less conversant with these problems and avidly drank in his every word. Tukhachevsky was an ace of military thinking, a star of the first magnitude among the great soldiers of the Red Army. This is what Marshal Zhukov says. It's clear that the legacy of Tukhachevsky's military thinking was not lost on his executions. I'll talk about this and other killings in a later lecture, but his legacy was not lost at all. If Stalin's aim was to cow the high command, then he certainly succeeded. Even in the face of complete disaster in 1941, there was no challenge to Stalin's authority from his generals, nor any dissent when he blamed military failures on incompetent commanders and had some of them shot even. But it would be misleading to say that Stalin dominated a high command consisting of a set of nitwits who stood trembling before him. When the generals had gained battle experience and learned from their mistakes, Stalin's wartime commanders performed outstandingly and developed a positive, collaborative relationship with the Soviet dictator, in which they displayed initiative, flair, and a good deal of independence. This is what is important. Whether or not their purged colleagues would have done any better in the circumstances remains at best a speculation. In any case, in 1941, the Red Army was the largest and most extensively equipped military force in the world, and the process of re-equipment and retraining and reorganization of armed forces continued even later during the time of war. During this time, 22-23, in 1932-33, the Soviet army was less than 1 million. The size of the Soviet army was less than 1 million. How was Stalin as a military leader? Many foreigners, including Churchill and Roosevelt, have left their impressions on him. The relationship between Roosevelt and Stalin remained very warm, as you could read that book by, what's her name, Susan Butler. Susan Butler describes it so beautifully in her book. Okay, Churchill, of course, was earlier dismissive of Stalin, but later was in awe of him, in fact. But let us see what Sukhov, who bore the brunt of Stalin's wrath, many times during the course of war, say about him. This is what Sukhov says. Okay. Stalin made a big personal contribution to the victory over Nazi Germany and his allies. His prestige was exceedingly high, and his appointment as Supreme Commander was wholeheartedly acclaimed by the people and the troops. Word is human, and of course, the Supreme Commander did make mistakes early in the war until the Stalingrad battle. But he took them close to heart, gave them deep thought, and sought to draw due lessons from them so as to never to repeat them again. As a rule, he was businesslike and calm. Everybody was permitted to state his opinion. He addressed everyone the same stern and formal manner. He had the knack of listening to people attentively, but only if they spoke to the point, if they knew what they were saying. Taciturn himself, he did not like talkative people and often interrupted those who spoke volubly with the curt, make it snappy or speak more clearly. He opened conferences without introductory words. He spoke quietly, freely, never departing from the substance of the matter. He was laconic and formulated his thoughts clearly. I realized during the war, this is very important, this is what Sukhov says. I realized during the war that Stalin was not the kind of man who objected to sharp questions or to anyone arguing with him. If someone says the reverse, he is a liar. This is what Sukhov says. Stalin wanted daily reports on the situation at the fronts, and one had to have the facts at one's fingertips to report to the Supreme Commander. One could not go to him with maps that had white spots on him, which means if you don't understand the maps, the various spots on the map, you don't go to him at all. One could not go to him with maps that had white spots on him or report approximate, much less exaggerated information. He did not tolerate hit or miss replies. He wanted them to be exhaustive and clear. The Supreme Commander had a knack of detecting weak spots in reports and documents. He saw them instantly and reprimanded the culprit most severely. He had a tenacious memory and remembered everything that was said to him and never missed an opportunity to take people to task for anything they forgot. That is why documents of the General Staff were always most carefully prepared. Okay, though of moderate height and externally undistinguished, Stalin produced a strong impression on whoever spoke with him. Free of affectations and mannerisms, he won people's hearts by his simple ways. Uninhibited way of speaking, the ability to express himself clearly, his inborn analytical mind, his extensive knowledge and phenomenal memory made even old hands and eminent people brace themselves and gather their wits when talking to him. Zhukov feared for his life? Nonsense. Zhukov wrote this in 1970, in fact, after 17 years after Stalin's death. The year 1941 was dominated by a few epic battles and sieges. I will cover the Leningrad siege in my next talk. The other important battles were the battle for Kiev and the offensive at Yelnya and the battle of Moscow. Okay. The Kiev battle, in fact, earlier I said what happened in Kiev. In Kiev battle, though the Soviet Union lost heavily, the loss to Hitler was also very heavy. Okay. Never in the entire history of Wehrmacht did it meet casualties as high as it met in Kiev. More than 100,000 troops died and 10 divisions were lost, which was very, very high. In the West, the entire war, they lost about 80,000 people, So this happened in one battle. So the Wehrmacht's loss was very, very high during that time. The Yelnya offensive, which happened, Yelnya is a city near Smolensk, which is of course east of Moscow, as I said. There, in fact, the Soviet army claimed the territory from Wehrmacht. In fact, they pushed the Wehrmacht. As Alexander Wirth says, here was the only, as it were, the first victory of Red Army over the Germans. And here was the first piece of territory, 100 to 150 miles conquered from the Wehrmacht in the whole of Europe. Till that time, till that summer of 1941, Wehrmacht never lost territory. That was the first time it lost territory, about 100 and 150 square miles. It is strange, this is what Alexander Wirth says, it is strange to think that 1941, even that was considered a big achievement. That was the prestige and the reputation, that was the reputation of the German army, the formidable German army. Okay. Smolensk city, of course, fell to the Germans in mid-July, but fierce battles continued to rage in that area. At stake for Soviet troops was blocking of Germans' path to Moscow, as I said, is less than 200 miles. However, even here, the Stavka, the Soviet High Command did not fight a defensive battle. His strategy was offensive, and it took numerous forms of counter-stoves, counter-attacks, counter-offensives, like the one in Yelnya. Often criticized, in retrospect, this strategy has its successes. The Germans were held up in Smolensk for 2 months, and the difficulties experienced by Wehrmacht persuaded Hitler to delay the march on Moscow and to divert forces to the seemingly softer targets of Leningrad and to the north, Leningrad in the north and Kiev in the south. The psychological boost of these battles, to Red Army was enormous, and the throwing back of the advance of Army Group Center was also very, very significant. But still, Moscow was in great danger. The Battle of Moscow, of course, began with two big disasters for Stalin. Okay. In early October, the Germans trapped 7 Soviet armies in massive encirclements. It was a devastating blow as they were defending the approaches of Moscow. The debacle was partly the result of German superior numbers. German had more guns and more aircraft and more manpower. Okay, but Stalin, of course, responded to the deteriorating military situation by recalling Zhukov from Leningrad to Moscow in October and placing in command of a new Western Front. In October, the Stavka ordered the formation of 10 reserve armies east of Moscow. During the course of Moscow battle, nearly 100 divisions were transferred to the center of the front, including 9 from the Far East, as Stalin decided that the Japanese were unlikely to join the German attack at this stage. Still, Moscow was in imminent danger of being conquered. This was November, and there was the question of whether to hold the traditional revolution parade on 7th November because of the German threat. Stalin, of course, rose to the occasion and produced a masterly performance. When the enemy at the gates of Moscow, he could hardly deny the seriousness of the danger. Indeed, he frankly admitted the full extent of the territorial losses to the Germans. But Stalin pointed out that Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg strategy had failed, and asked why the lightning war had succeeded in Western Europe and not in the Soviet Union. There were, said Stalin, 3 reasons why Wehrmacht failed in the West. His reason was Hitler's failure to enlist Britain and the United States into an anti-Bolshevik coalition. Stalin was very, very clear. He was sure that if Britain and USA had allied with Germany in 1941, Soviet Union would not have survived. He said this he said very, very clearly. Okay. Second, he said, Germans had counted on the instability and unreliability of the Soviet home front. That is on class and ethnic differences. The Ukrainian thing which these guys are talking about, They relied, he said they will all rise in revolt, which didn't happen at all. Some thugs, some Nazi thugs, scoundrels, traitors who joined the Germans, okay. But the ordinary Ukrainians, they fought with this army, okay. So that didn't happen. The ethnic differences, all those things Hitler wanted to exploit, that exploitation did not happen. Third, the most important, he said, Germans had underestimated the strength of the Red Army and its capacity to maintain morale and wage an effective defense of its motherland. Regarding what he characterized as the temporary reverses of Red Army, Stalin highlighted 2 factors. One is the most important factor, the absence of a second front in Europe and shortage of tanks. Okay. This is what he said. See, these are the things. He said that's why the reverses happened, because there's no second front in Europe, and the Red Army did not have as many tanks as it would have required. In any case, on 7th November, mocking Hitler, Stalin addressed the troops parading through Red Square. The situation was grave, Stalin told them, but the Soviet regime had faced even greater difficulties in the past, but they overcome all those difficulties. Stalin said, a great liberation mission has fallen to your lot. Be worthy of this mission. Let the many images of our great ancestors, Alexander Nevsky was the guy who defeated the Swedes, and Dmitry Donskoy who beat the Tatars, Kurma Minin and Dmitry Posharsky who drove the Poles out of Moscow, and of course Alexander Suvorov and Michael Kutuzov, the great generals of the Napoleonic wars, inspire you in this war. This is what Stalin said. May the victorious banner of the great Lenin be your lodestar. This was how he finished his address to the Soviet soldiers. Stalin's speeches were reprinted in the Soviet press and distributed in leaflet form throughout the armed forces. The speeches were translated, and millions more leaflets printed in German, Italian, Finnish, Hungarian, Romanian and Spanish for use in propaganda war on the front line. The days following the speeches, Soviet military censors examined millions of citizens' letters and from the front and reported a significant upswing in the popular mood. Hitler, of course, on the other hand, was full of rage. Not a single German plane could broke through the air defenses and bomb the city of Moscow. The heroism of the people of Moscow has been recorded. This is very, very important. You should listen to this. Unlike the traitors, the traitors of the Soviet Union, what the people of Moscow they did. Hundreds and thousands of Muscovites. This is what This is what been recorded. I am reading the record. Hundreds and thousands of Muscovites worked day and night during the building fortified lines around the city. Something like 250,000 with women and teenagers comprising 3/4 of that number erected the interior defensive perimeter in October and November alone. They built as much as 72,000 meters of anti-tank ditches, some 80,000 meters of escarpments and counter-escarpments, 52,000 meters of anti-tank and other obstacles, and dug nearly 128,000 meters of communication and other trenches. All in all, they moved 3 million cubic meters of earth by hand. This showing of workers and engineers at the plants that had not been evacuated from Moscow was truly selfless and dedicated. They worked with obsolete equipment, for all the good machinery had been evacuated. There was a shortage of manpower, but military production was started in an amazingly short time. The Moscow Motor Works began making submachine guns, first ball bearings plant, and other works supplying breech locks for them. The Moscow plants were ordered to produce 35 times as much as they had produced in November, and they coped with the assignment. Watch and clock factories started production of mine detonators, and the trolleybus depot in Moscow district started making hand grenades like this. All garages and car depots were busy repairing tanks and other army vehicles. Okay, this was how the ordinary people of Moscow rose to the occasion. If they had not loved the country, if they had not loved Stalin, they would not have done this at all. It did not happen in the West. They simply collapsed. When Hitler attacked Western Europe, they simply folded up. Paris was declared an open city, in fact. There were such covers that Paris was declared an open city. So Paris was not bombed at all. They surrendered, That surrender was not done by the citizens of Russia. They wanted to fight Hitler and his horde because Stalin was a leader and they had to defend the Russia he had built. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Okay. Zhukov, in fact, submitted his plan for a counteroffensive in front of Moscow to Stalin on 30th November, and the operation began 5 days later. Okay. In fact, Stalin was absolutely ebullient. He said, Russians have been in Berlin twice already and they will be there third time, he said. But because of the skill and the military genius of Zhukov, by mid-September, the Germans had been forced back 200 miles from Moscow across a broad front. On 16th October, the commander of the Army Group Center, Bock, asked Hitler for permission to make a defensive withdrawal, but Hitler refused, which was a good thing because the Soviet counteroffensive went on till early next year before losing steam. However, in the Battle of Moscow, Germans lost more than 500,000 officers and men, and they lost about 1,500 tanks and 2,500 artillery pieces. Their loss was many. The loss was very, very big, and they were not able to make good this loss. In fact, the 1941-42 Soviet winter counteroffensive was conducted in difficult conditions, which people forget. But even more important, without numerical superiority over the enemy. The Soviet forces, in addition, did not have even full armored and mechanized units, without which a large-scale offensive were quite difficult. During those times, it was even considered impossible. But they still did and won against a much superior army. What about the notorious winter? Shukov Kane, he answers this question convincingly. He says, Generals Guderian and Hoth and others consider the severe Russian climate coupled with Hitler's miscalculations to be the main reason for the defeat near Moscow. Of course, weather and climate play a definite role in any combat action and equally affect the combatants on both sides. Warm clothes and uniforms are also a weapon. This is what he says. Warm clothes and uniforms are also a weapon. Our country fed and clothed her soldiers, but the Nazi army was not prepared for the winter. The German leaders believed the Russian campaigns would be little short of a walkover, taking just months or weeks. Obviously, the Nazi ringleaders grossly miscalculated politically and strategically and not simply with the climate. This is what Shukov says. Other generals and bourgeois historians put all the blame on mud and lack of roads. There's nothing new about this version either. Napoleon made the same remark about 150 years ago. Okay, but I was there to see thousands upon thousands of Moscow women, not particularly suited for the arduous job of sapping, who had left their comfortable homes to dig anti-tank trenches and ditches, put up barricades, construct asperges and other obstacles, and carry sandbags. Mud stuck to their feet and to the wheels of the barrows in which they carried earth. Mud stuck to the blades of the spades, making them unwieldy in the hands of the women. For the benefit of those who are inclined to hide behind the mud as a real reason for the German defeat near Moscow, I would like to add that the period of slush in October 1941 was comparatively short. Cold weather set in and snow fell in early November, making the terrain and road passable everywhere. At the time of all-out German offensive in November, the temperature in Moscow area was 7 to 10 degrees below zero, which anyone can well imagine means there was no slush. This is what Shukov says. The war in 1941 was a test for Stalin's leadership and the support he had from the ordinary people of Russia. On both counts, he came out the winner. The defeat of Nazis at the gates of Moscow made the world leaders realize that Red Army was not a ragtag circus. Why then the majority of the books that have come out of the West underplay the achievements of Stalin, the Red Army and the Soviet people? The reason is simple. Number one is anti-communism and the other reason is pure racism. The West is still not reconciled to the fact that the Slavic people could win over the racially superior Teutons, the blood brothers of Anglo-Saxons. The earlier books, if you read the earlier books, Stalin was in fact called Asiatic and hence he behaved the way he did. Now, of course, it is not very politic to call him so. Therefore, these guys, many of them CIA sponsored, invent ingenious methods to denigrate Russia of those days. We have nothing to do with the West, and hence we Indians should not see Stalin with the spectacles provided by these Western writers. Okay, Stalin, after all, did not move out of Soviet Union until later. Whatever crimes he was supposed to have committed was within the Soviet Union, and thus it is for the Soviet people and the present day Russians to judge them. It is no accident that even today, in spite of sustained hostile propaganda, he still remains the most popular Russian leader. By the end of 1941, Russian army had lost about 200 divisions in battle and suffered a stunning 4 million casualties. Many more men and divisions were lost in the futile counteroffensive of early 1942. But what was important was that the Soviet regime had survived Hitler's war of annihilation and had halted and turned back the German invasion. Stalin was confident that the tide of war would continue to turn his way. But the greatest test of the Soviet system and Stalin's war leadership was yet to come. I will take up the second part of the Russian saga in my next talk.